On today's episode, get ready to set your watch back to ancient times, to 9000 BCE, when, as we have said before, modern man had discovered agriculture and was growing crops and domesticating animals. This created a surplus of food, which they learned to preserve and store, all of which led to the rise of early civilizations and the Bronze Age. But how? Almost the first thing you would have to do once you were creating a food surplus was to protect it from your hungry neighbours, or hunter-gatherers who were passing through your settled area. This meant developing what today we call a civil engineering. Put simply, you needed to build granaries to store your grain, fruit, smoked or salted meat and fish. Most importantly, you needed a wall protecting all of these facilities and warriors to man the wall and guard the gate. The most important resource was of course fresh water, so either you needed wells within the walls or a river diverted to the settlement, creating two more gaps in and out which needed to be guarded 24/7. All these civil engineering projects needed stones, which had to be quarried, shaped and put together. Now the earliest settlement which had all these features that has so far been discovered is Jericho, which archaeologists date as being built between 830-50 and 730-50 BCE. For example, the water source, a spring, is mentioned in the Bible, but also means only one gap in the wall, letting the sewage out. The walls of Jericho enclosed a space of 10 acres. Now this could be called a civilization. The food surplus was protected, as were the non-food producing individuals who were free to do other things such as develop pottery, start early experiments in smelting copper, discover the wheel, and so on, but critically, defending the walls. So civilization depended on a protected agricultural surplus, but what if your water source dried up? Or the weather was unfavourable for crop growth, or domesticated animals caught a disease? All of this could happen and did happen to early walled settlements. There were two solutions. You could pray to whoever controlled the water source, the weather, and distributed diseases for deliverance, or you could gather your warriors and go and steal somebody else's calories. Both solutions required a hierarchy. The first, priests to tell you who controlled what and how to pray, and in the second case, a military leader capable of leading your warriors to success. Inevitably, the two hierarchies would become one. The first real city, 32 acres inside its walls, was in Anatolia, modern Turkey, was called Catal Huyuk, which flourished between 6250 and 5400 BCE. Here there is evidence of copper smelting, pottery and wool weaving. Meanwhile, other more widely separated walled cities grew up between the Tigris and the Euphrates and along the Nile from about 5000 BCE. However, it was a further 2000 years before these coalesced into empires with major cities as we would understand them. Along the Nile, a highly sophisticated, religiously based civilization depending on a belief in a very well organised afterlife developed, which led to huge civil engineering projects. For example, the Great Pyramid of Cheops, constructed at Giza around 2590 BCE. Marginally later, the world's first genuine empire emerged between the Tigris and the Euphrates, with the first Persian Empire founded by Sargon I between 2371 and 2230 BCE. The copper smelting we told you about earlier developed into bronze, the first alloy, a mixture of metals or metal and chemicals. Originally, copper was mixed with arsenic to smelt it into bronze. There are early examples of this in the Near East from around 4000 BCE, ushering in the beginning of the Bronze Age, which obviously took a considerable time to spread, bringing with it swords, spears, arrowheads, armour and ploughs. But it became far more widespread when it was realised that you could smelt copper with tin to make bronze. Out with the arsenic and in with the tin. There were small deposits of tin dotted around the Near and Middle East, but the only really substantial deposits were much further west, in Bohemia, the Czech Republic, the northeastern corner of the Iberian Peninsula, which also had good deposits of copper, and Cornwall. Now to get all these supplies in any bulk, you needed to be able to sail ships through the Mediterranean and then work your way up the Atlantic coastline. This began in the Aegean about 2000 BCE. If you have been on holiday in the Greek islands, you will know that if you climb up on the highest point of your island, you can often see one or more other islands. It's not really surprising that sailing ships developed first there. Bronze was also being developed in other parts of the world. Around 3000 BCE, bronze began to be smelted and used in Thailand, which had a rice-based agricultural system. Since around 6000 BCE, About 2750 BCE, civilizations began to develop in the Indus Valley. Surprisingly, given the first Chinese city developed around 3500 BCE, it was not until around 1600 BCE that urban civilizations began to develop a Bronze Age culture there. In the Americas, pottery began to appear in what is today Ecuador and Colombia around 3000 BCE, but it was not for another 1000 years that metalworking was discovered in the Americas, in Peru. In a nutshell, the Americas were lagging behind in other regions of the world in the development of technologies helpful to developing cities and civilization, and it was not until around 1150 BCE that the beginning of civilization took place in Mexico under the Olmecs. Perhaps the major problem for the Americas was the lack of suitable animals to act as drought animals. Europe and Asia had oxen, horses, reindeer, camels, yaks and water buffaloes. In contrast, until the arrival of Europeans, North America had nothing, and South America could counter with the llama. The llama is no match in comparison to other four-legged working animals in Europe and Asia. Three civilizations developed because of their mastery of the sea. In the eastern Mediterranean, the Phoenicians, who like the ancient Greeks were a federation of city-states occupying the coast of modern northern Israel, all of Lebanon and most of modern Syria's coastline and the immediate hinterland. Although founded in about 2000 BCE, it was not until 1100 BCE that their influence really began to matter as their ability to sail the Mediterranean and trade extensively grew. It has been suggested that the Phoenicians traded with Cornwall. Economically, one can see why they might have traded ingots of bronze for ingots of tins. However, there is neither archaeological evidence nor written evidence that this occurred, and they did like to have settlements where they traded. The most famous of these was Carthage, which was founded in 1814 BCE. Later, Carthage, by then an imperial power, was probably the Roman Republic's greatest enemy. In addition, first Cornwall was an excellent source of tin, so was the northeastern section of the Iberian Peninsula, which of the Phoenicians would have found much easier to trade with. The Phoenicians were also responsible for developing alphabetic script, which formed the basis for most European written languages. Writing goes back to 3100 BCE to the Sumerian civilization in the Tigris-Euphrates. What was its first use? The poetry of Homer and Hesiod? No, that would only happen around 750 BCE. No, the first use of writing was accountancy. King's leaders needed to know what they were worth, what weapons they had stored in their armories, and many other facts to operate efficiently. The Phoenicians needed lists and ledgers to trade efficiently. No point in paying more for something than you needed last time, unless you thought it was commercially sensible, so you needed records. Very savvy indeed. Once again, think back to your holiday in Greece. Do you think of cheese when on holiday there, other than feta, a mixture of goat's and sheep's milk? No, you don't. Why? Well, the grazing isn't great. The soil may be okay for olives, sheep and goats, but you don't see large herds of cows being milked and producing wonderful dairy products. One function of this is a lower population density, so once you reach larger numbers they can either go hungry or emigrate, which is what the Greek city-states they did from around 750, which they could, as like the Phoenicians they had a navy, so they did, establishing colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, where in 753 BCE Rome was founded in central Italy. One function of civilization is quite clear. It's going to develop depending on what resources and technologies you have. A good example of this is the wheel, massively useful in Europe, the Near East, all over Asia and North Africa. However, in the Americas it was only useful as a religious symbol or on toys. Why? Remember that you also need a strong domesticated animal to pull your cart or chariot that has wheels. The Olmecs and their successors only had the llama. Europe and the rest had much stronger drought animals. The final seaborne culture to discuss relating to the Bronze Age is the Polynesians, who began to spread from modern-day Indonesia out into the immensity of the Pacific around 2000 BCE, reaching Fiji around 1300 BCE. By then, they had morphed into Polynesians, and were without question the greatest sailors on the planet for a long period, because they eventually made it to the Hawaiian Islands around 1000 to 1200 BCE. A journey of over 2,000 miles. How did they do it? Well, we can only really summarise. They did not have the technology of writing. They did have agriculture and religion, but not writing. So what we know of them is from their oral tradition. So to summarise what we can learn from the rise of early civilisations in the Bronze Age. For civilisations to thrive, they need a fairly benign environment. None of the civilisations discussed started in jungles or deserts. Even a single natural event can have a catastrophic long-term effect on a civilisation. The Minoan civilization, which thrived on Crete from around 2000 BCE until circa 1450 BCE, was dealt a fatal blow by the explosion of a volcano on the nearby island of Santorini, circa 1600 BCE, which it never really recovered from. If people are comfortable and well fed, they tend not to emigrate into the unknown. Greek civilization began circa 3200 BCE, but it was not until population pressure forced them to do so that they began to establish colonies throughout the Mediterranean from roughly 750 BCE onwards. Of course, they could only emigrate once they had mastered sailing. Even the seas of the Mediterranean are not always calm. There are many more trends and features that humanity will throw up into the thousands of years after the Bronze Age. We will eventually unearth many of them.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and watch our next episode.